Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel, where we don't just tell stories, we bring you into them. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place and felt like the air changed the moment you arrived? Not because you said a word, not because you did anything wrong, just because of who you are or what you look like. Racism today doesn't always come as a shout. It doesn't always wear a hood or carry a burning torch. More often, it comes as a smirk, a glance, a polite voice that says, "Please step aside." It hides in the small moments that pile up until they weigh on your soul like lead. Some people say, times have changed, why dig up the past? Things aren't that bad anymore.
I understand there are
But
many
others
questions.
know the
I will answer
truth.
them in due course, but for
When
now, I
injustice
need to focus
hides
on what
in
matters
plain sight,
most.
it cuts deeper.
I understand there are many
Because if no
questions.
one
I will
notices,
answer them in due
no one
course, but for
stops it.
now, I
So,
need to focus on what
where do you
matters
stand?
most.
Are you willing to see what so many choose to ignore? Before we dive into today's story, a story of humiliation, power, and a quiet reckoning that left an entire company on its knees, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us keep telling the stories that others are too afraid to touch. On a midnight flight over the Atlantic, a world-famous singer sits in first class ignored for 8 hours, treated like she doesn't exist, while others are pampered around her. She says nothing. But when the wheels touch down in New York, her silence will ignite a firestorm that will bring an airline to its knees and change an entire industry forever. Now, lean in. This one might just change how you see the world. Under the dim cabin lights, Flight 427 felt more like a floating ghost ship than a red eye from Paris to New York. Outside the windows, the Atlantic stretched out as a black void, the only movement the silver streak of the jet cutting through the sky. Inside, the air hummed with the steady drone of engines, the occasional clinking of wine glasses, and the low murmur of conversations between the comfortably seated. But for one passenger, it was not a flight, it was an erasure. In seat 4A, Naomi Ellison sat quietly, her posture elegant but unassuming. At 34, she had sung to sold-out crowds in London, Paris, and Berlin only days ago. Her voice had filled arenas, her name had trended worldwide, and her songs had racked up millions of streams overnight. But tonight, there were no stage lights, no stylists, no entourage. She wore a black hoodie, fitted jeans, and sneakers. Her face was bare of makeup, her hair tied back. She looked for all the world like any ordinary traveler, anonymity she craved for once. But in the eyes of the crew, it became an excuse. From the moment she boarded, she felt it, the invisible line drawn around her. The warm greetings that flowed so freely to others never reached her ears. No drink was offered, no menu handed over, no small gesture of service extended. At first, Naomi told herself it was nothing, perhaps a delay, perhaps a simple oversight. She had endured enough subtle slights in her life to know that calling them out too early often led to a performance of fake apologies. So she waited. An hour passed, then two. She watched as a businessman 2 rows ahead sipped his second glass of Bordeaux, the stewardess leaning in with laughter at his stories. Across the aisle, a young couple was treated to a dessert tray, their hands held as the attendant explained each option, like it was a Michelin-starred tasting. Naomi pressed her call button, once waited 10 minutes, then again. No one came. The button's soft glow became a tiny beacon of her isolation. Around her, whispers began to stir, not from the crew, but from fellow passengers. Eyes darted toward her, some with pity, some with confusion. They could see it too, the woman who was, for reasons unspoken, treated as if she were invisible. Every time a stewardess glided past without meeting her gaze, the tension in the cabin deepened, like a quiet accusation no one wanted to voice. Naomi stayed silent. Her calm was not weakness, it was calculation. Years in the spotlight had taught her a cruel lesson. Anger was a weapon easily turned against you, especially when your skin carried centuries of others' prejudice. She folded her hands in her lap and simply observed every slight catalogued, every avoidance noted. If they wanted to act as though she didn't exist, she would let them for now. The silence finally broke, not by Naomi, but by a voice that carried the weight of both age and conviction. Across the aisle, an elderly man in a tweed jacket, his silver hair catching the faint cabin light, leaned toward a passing stewardess. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. "Excuse me," he said, his tone cutting through the hush like a bell. "Why hasn't this young woman been served? I've watched for hours as you've skipped her seat. This is unacceptable." The stewardess froze mid-step. Her polished smile flickered, faltered. Heads turned. A ripple passed through the cabin as murmurs rose, passengers suddenly emboldened by the voice that had said what they were all thinking. Naomi met the attendant's eyes for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, not anger, not even relief, but something deeper. A calm acknowledgement, as if to say, "Now you see me." Finally, drinks and food arrived at last set before her with mechanical politeness, but the gesture was hollow, and Naomi knew it. Every sip of water tasted like a reluctant concession, every bite of food like a transaction rather than an apology. Around her whispers continued some supportive others, merely curious, a few uncomfortable. Naomi remained still, her face serene, her silence now sharper than any words could be. As the plane droned through the night, Naomi gazed out at the ink-black expanse below the faint reflection of her face in the glass. She didn't need to remind them who she was. She didn't need to shout, to demand, to threaten. Her time would come. She knew the value of patience, of allowing a story to bloom into something undeniable. Some reckonings aren't delivered at 37,000 feet in the cramped aisle of a dimmed cabin. Some are best saved for when the wheels touch the ground, when the cameras flash, and when those who tried to erase you realize the world is watching. By the time the seatbelt sign chimed for descent, Naomi had barely spoken a word. But her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And when Flight 427 touched down at JFK, everyone on that plane, from the inattentive attendants to the whispering passengers, would understand something Naomi Ellison knew all too well. Sometimes the quietest storms leave the most lasting damage, and this one was about to make headlines. The murmurs began as soft as the hum of the engines, an undercurrent beneath the steady rhythm of the flight. They weren't loud enough to disrupt, but impossible to ignore once they started. Naomi Ellison didn't need to strain to hear them. Years of standing on stages and listening for cues in the quiet between songs had sharpened her ability to catch words others missed. Snippets of voices floated from the nearby rows, a mix of confusion, sympathy, and thinly veiled indignation. "Why hasn't she been offered anything yet?" a woman whispered to her husband, her voice low, but tinged with irritation. "We've had 2 rounds of drinks." "Maybe she's not in this cabin," another murmured. "You know, some people sneak forward when it's half empty." "That's not right." A deeper voice interjected the elderly man in tweed who had spoken earlier now, quietly but firmly adding, "I've been watching. She hasn't done a thing wrong. They're just ignoring her." Naomi sat still, her posture regal, despite the hoodie and jeans, her face impassive, as if carved from calm marble. She had learned long ago that in certain moments, the smallest flicker of reaction, a raised brow, a clenched jaw could be twisted, magnified, and used against her. She had no interest in giving anyone ammunition tonight. Instead, she became a quiet center in a growing storm, the eye of something subtle yet undeniable. The crew, meanwhile, carried on with the meticulous choreography of service pouring wine, offering warmed nuts, adjusting blankets for other passengers. But Naomi saw the tension in their movements, now a stiffness creeping into their smiles. They could feel the weight of the cabin's attention, the whispers like a tide rising behind them. One attendant, a young woman whose polished expression betrayed a flicker of guilt, met Naomi's eyes for a fraction of a second before looking away. It wasn't enough to change anything, but it told Naomi one crucial thing they all knew. This wasn't an oversight, it was a choice, and choices had consequences. The elderly man's voice carried again, this time a touch louder enough that the two attendants closest to the galley froze mid-step. "I've flown with this airline for 20 years," he said, his voice deliberate, each syllable landing with the weight of lived authority. "Never in my life have I seen a passenger treated like this. Someone should explain it before I do more than whisper." Heads turned. People who had been sipping wine or scrolling through screens now lifted their eyes, openly watching. A young woman near the aisle, barely in her 20s, raised her phone slightly screen, tilted as if she might start recording. The tension that had simmered quietly now began to boil. Naomi breathed in, slow and steady, her fingers brushing the edge of her seat's armrest. It would take so little, a single word, a flash of her name, a quiet revelation of who she was, to shift the energy completely. A single sentence, and the attendants who had so casually bypassed her would scramble with trays and apologies, desperate to erase what they had done. She could have done it hours ago, but that would have turned this into another story about ego, about a celebrity pulling rank to get her way. That wasn't the story Naomi wanted told. Instead, she let the whispers build. Every second the silence held, the discomfort grew heavier, not just for her, but for everyone watching. The longer she waited, the clearer it became that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a statement made by the very people trained to serve without judgment. The cabin, once a sanctuary of hushed luxury, was shifting into something else entirely. A courtroom, a stage, a powder keg. One of the attendants finally broke. A tall man with neatly slicked hair, his voice carefully modulated but laced with something brittle, stopped by Naomi's row. "Ma'am," he said, his tone pitched somewhere between customer service and command. "I understand you haven't been served yet. Would you like something now?" The words were polite, but his delivery was clinical, devoid of the warmth she'd seen lavished on others. The offer wasn't hospitality, it was damage control. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, her gaze level and calm, and then shook her head. "No, thank you," she said softly. Her refusal was quiet, but in the charged air of the cabin, it landed like a gavel. More whispers. This time, they weren't about Naomi. They were about them, the crew. The murmurs spread in ripples. "She refused," someone noted. "Can you blame her?" another added. The young woman with the phone lifted it higher, this time openly, the small red light of a recording app catching the reflection of the cabin lights. The attendants exchanged glances, their polished professionalism beginning to crack at the edges. For Naomi, this was exactly the moment she had been waiting for. Not a grand confrontation, but the subtle unraveling of their authority. She knew the power of perception, how a single shared video, a single headline could ignite a fire that no corporate statement could put out. And she understood something else, that staying calm, letting others witness the injustice without her voice raising an octave, would turn her into something far more powerful than an angry passenger. She would become a mirror, reflecting the ugliness they had revealed on their own. As the whispers grew, the cabin took on a different kind of quiet one, filled not with ignorance, but awareness. People were no longer just watching, they were remembering. Every detail, every skipped row, every glance exchanged by the crew would be etched into their minds, ready to spill into conversations, tweets, and camera lenses the moment they landed. Naomi folded her hands in her lap again, her breathing even. The storm was still building, but it wouldn't break here. Not yet. She wasn't after free wine or an apology whispered behind galley curtains. She was after something larger, something undeniable, something that would ripple far beyond the confines of this cabin. And when the wheels touched down in New York, she would make sure the entire world felt it. The cabin had shifted from quiet tension to a near audible thrum, like a wire pulled too tight. Every breath felt heavier, every glance sharper, and the whispers now carried an energy that even the crew could no longer pretend to ignore. It was Harold Bennett, the elderly man in tweed, whose quiet words had stirred the first ripple, who finally shattered what remained of the fragile calm. His voice, resonant despite his age, cut through the air like the crack of a whip. "I want an explanation." He said, his tone firm, but controlled the kind of voice honed over a lifetime of commanding boardrooms and committees. He rose slightly from his seat, not fully standing, but enough for his presence to demand attention. The overhead lights caught the silver in his hair, giving him a certain gravitas that no title card could match. This woman, he gestured toward Naomi with an open hand, his eyes flicking briefly to meet hers with quiet respect, has been sitting here for nearly 7 hours, and not once has she been treated as a paying passenger. Not once has she been offered food, drink, or even basic acknowledgement, while others, including myself, have been doted upon repeatedly. Why? The question hung in the air, a live current no one wanted to touch. The lead attendant, the tall man with slicked hair, stepped forward, his expression schooled into the neutral mask airlines train into their crews. "Sir, we—" No, Harold interrupted his voice, still calm but unyielding. "Don't give me a rehearsed line. I've flown across this ocean more times than I can count. I know the difference between a delay and a decision. And I know, as does everyone here, that this wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. So, I'll ask again why passengers turned in their seats, now openly, their eyes shifting between Harold, Naomi, and the crew. The cabin had become a kind of tribunal, every silent witness waiting for a verdict. The younger attendant, the one whose guilt had flickered earlier, kept her eyes down. The lead attendant's jaw tightened, his carefully groomed professionalism beginning to fracture under the collective scrutiny. Naomi stayed silent, her gaze fixed out the small oval window, watching the darkness of the Atlantic swallow the wing lights. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence had already done more to unmask the truth than anger ever could. The murmurs began again, louder now, no longer whispers, but voices carrying. A man too rose up, turned, and said, "She paid for this seat like we all did. If this is how you treat someone because of how they look, I'll be filing my own complaint the moment we land." Another, a middle-aged woman traveling with her teenage daughter, added, "My daughter is watching this. What am I supposed to tell her? That this is how the world works?" It was no longer just Harold's voice. The passengers were aligning their unease, turning into something sharper anger, solidarity, a collective refusal to let the scene dissipate into the cabin air like stale coffee. The lead attendant's composure faltered visibly now. His smile, so effortless earlier in the flight, looked brittle, his hands fidgeting against the front of his uniform jacket. "Ladies and gentlemen, we understand your concerns." He began, his voice tight. "But I assure you, there's no." There is Harold cut in again, his voice firmer, louder now. "And everyone here knows it. You can dress it up in corporate apologies later, but the truth is, and how we've all watched her sit here, invisible to you while you circled this cabin, like she wasn't even here. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. And choices, young man, carry consequences." The words echoed like a warning bell. Naomi turned her head slightly, finally meeting Harold's eyes. There was no gratitude in her look. Not yet, but a shared understanding, a recognition that his voice had become the amplifier for the quiet storm she had been building. The younger attendant, clearly shaken, now moved closer to Naomi with a tray. "Ma'am, please, can we offer you something now? A meal? A drink? Anything you'd like." Her voice trembled slightly, as though she knew the futility of the gesture, but hoped it might soften the blow of what was unraveling. Naomi's reply was soft, steady, and final. "No, I think we're past that." The refusal hung in the air heavier than any confrontation could have been. Harold straightened in his seat, turning his voice not just to the crew, now, but to the cabin. "Document everything," he said loudly, glancing pointedly toward the young woman with the phone and anyone else listening. "Record it, remember it, and when we land, make sure it's heard. People like this airline rely on silence. Don't give it to them." It was as if he had thrown a match into a room full of dry tinder. Several phones came up, screens glowing faintly in the dim cabin. The crew stiffened their smiles, vanishing entirely, now replaced by the stark, unpolished faces of people who understood they were no longer in control of the narrative. Naomi leaned back into her seat, her hands folded gently in her lap. She still hadn't said, her name hadn't hinted at who she was, or the tidal wave of attention her eventual reveal would bring. She didn't need to. Right now, the weight of the passengers' outrage, the digital evidence already being compiled, and Harold Bennett's commanding voice had set the stage. The roar wasn't loud, not in decibels, but in impact. It was the sound of power, shifting of a collective decision, that the injustice they'd all witnessed would not dissolve into the quiet anonymity of a red-eye flight. The cabin had become a story, one that wouldn't stay 37,000 feet above the earth for long. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips, not of triumph, but of resolve. The crescendo had begun, and she knew exactly how it would end when the wheels touched down. The real storm was waiting on the ground, and she was ready to face it on her own terms. The first hints of dawn were brushing across the horizon as the plane descended toward John F. Kennedy International Airport. The cabin lights had been dimmed for landing, but the air was still electric thick with the unspoken tension of everything that had unfolded over the past 8 hours. Naomi's quiet endurance, Harold Bennett's unwavering defense, the murmurs that had turned into solidarity, all of it simmered beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. Outside the oval windows, New York City glimmered faintly beneath the early morning haze, the skyline rising like a defiant promise. Inside, the passengers felt something different: anticipation. They knew somehow that what had happened on this plane wouldn't end at the gate. There was a sense of inevitability that the landing itself would become more than just a routine arrival. It would be the spark that lit everything ablaze. Naomi sat perfectly composed, her back straight, her gaze calm, as she gathered the few belongings she'd placed beneath her seat. Her silence wasn't resignation. It was control, a choice she had made from the very beginning. Every minute she had withheld her identity had sharpened the blade of what was coming next. While the attendants bustled through their landing duties, their smiles gone, their movements rushed and mechanical, Naomi remained the eye of the hurricane. Harold leaned toward her, his voice low and respectful. "Are you ready for what's about to happen?" Naomi's eyes flicked to meet his. There was no fear there, no doubt. I was ready the moment they decided I didn't exist. She zipped her coat, her movements precise, deliberate. They wanted to erase me. Now they're about to find out who I really am. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, a murmur rippled through the cabin. Phones discreetly tilted toward the windows, recording the landing the city beyond, and the quiet figure in seat 3A, who had without a single outburst transformed the energy of the entire flight. The plane taxied toward the gate, but instead of the usual monotony, every second felt heightened, like the moments before a curtain lifts on a performance everyone knows will make headlines. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, the attendants went through their motions with mechanical precision, studiously avoiding Naomi's eyes. The lead attendant, his polished exterior fraying by the minute, avoided making any announcements beyond the bare minimum. He knew the whispers, the recordings, the murmurs had already escaped his control. He could feel his career teetering on a knife's edge. The jet bridge connected with a muted thud, and the first passengers began to file out, some glancing back at Naomi with a mixture of curiosity and respect, others whispering into their phones. The younger attendant, whose guilt had been palpable since Harold spoke up, lingered near Naomi's brow, as if wanting to apologize but unable to form the words. Naomi stood, without acknowledging her, lifting her simple leather bag onto her shoulder. But as she approached the front of the aircraft, the atmosphere shifted. Through the narrow windows by the door, flashes of camera lights were already visible on the tarmac. A small crowd of reporters stood beyond the gate's glass wall, their lenses glinting like predatory eyes. Someone, perhaps a passenger, perhaps one of Naomi's silent allies on board, had let the world know what was waiting to unfold. Naomi stepped into the jet bridge, each click of her boots against the floor echoing louder than it should. The morning chill from the terminal swept in, carrying with it the hum of distant voices, the crackle of radios, the faint but unmistakable buzz of a moment turning into a spectacle. Behind her, Harold followed at a respectful distance, his tweed coat draped over one arm, his expression firm. The terminal beyond the frosted glass doors erupted the moment she emerged. The flashes intensified, questions overlapping in a chaotic storm. "Ms. Clark, is it true you were denied service? Do you plan to take legal action? What do you say to the airline?" The name hit the air like a lightning strike, revealing what the crew had failed to grasp the entire flight. Naomi Clark, the Grammy-winning, chart-topping singer-songwriter who had just sold out shows across Europe, wasn't just another passenger. She was a household name, a cultural force, whose voice carried far beyond music. Naomi didn't raise her voice or wave for attention. She simply paused, letting the cameras capture her calm, collected presence. Her coat fell open slightly, revealing the understated black attire that had helped her blend into anonymity hours earlier. She glanced back briefly at the plane at the door, where the crew still lingered, like statues, their faces drained of color as the reality of what they'd done settled like lead in their bones. Facing the cameras, Naomi spoke evenly, each word deliberate. I was ignored on that flight for nearly 8 hours, not because I didn't pay for my seat, not because I caused any trouble, but because I didn't fit the picture some people think belongs in first class. I chose not to speak up, then, because I wanted the truth to be seen, not argued. You've all seen it now. Her words weren't a tirade, they were measured, factual, undeniable. The crowd hung on every syllable, the reporters scrambling to broadcast her statement live. Behind her, Harold stopped just short of the flashing lights, content to let Naomi own the moment. Though his presence, this dignified older man, who had dared to challenge the injustice mid-flight, added weight to the unfolding story. The airline's representative, a flustered man in a navy suit, pushed his way through the crowd, his corporate smile trembling. Ms. Clark, on behalf of Naomi, raised a hand, silencing him without raising her voice. Save it for your public statement. You'll be making one soon. Her gaze was unyielding, but her tone remained calm. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no gloating. Just the quiet certainty of someone who knew she held the leverage to force a reckoning. Cameras flashed again, capturing the moment she turned away from the gate and began walking through the terminal, the crowd parting instinctively. Her silence even now spoke louder than outrage ever could. The airline would face the storm she had summoned, not through anger, but through exposure, through the undeniable weight of a truth laid bare in front of the world. By the time Naomi reached the terminal's exit, her phone was already buzzing statements from her publicist, messages of support, from peers' calls, from advocacy groups ready to amplify her story. The flight attendant, still behind the plane's door, could only watch through the narrow window as the woman they had dismissed walked into a media frenzy that would leave their airline scrambling to contain the damage. The landing hadn't just brought Naomi Clark home. It had delivered a reckoning. And for everyone who had witnessed her quiet resilience at 37,000 feet, it was clear the storm was only just beginning, and this time it wouldn't be happening in silence. By the time Naomi Clark stepped into the glass-walled conference room at the Midtown Manhattan office of her public relations team, the story had already ignited like wildfire. Overnight clips from passengers whispered videos of her being bypassed by attendants. Harold Bennett, quietly standing in her defense, the hushed murmurs of first-class travelers had gone viral. Millions of people had already seen her calm words from the terminal, standing before flashing cameras, stating plainly what had happened. By morning, Jacques, Naomi Clark, and Invisible, in first, were trending worldwide. The airline's logo was being dissected across news outlets, each story asking the same question: how could this happen? And what would Naomi do next? She didn't enter the room like a victim seeking pity. Naomi walked in with the same composure she'd held during the flight, a quiet but commanding presence that made the room fall silent. Her manager, Evelyn Shaw, sat at the head of the table, a tablet already flooded with press inquiries. The airline is scrambling, Evelyn said, without preamble. They want a private apology statement, drafted settlement offer on the table. They're desperate to keep this quiet. Naomi lowered herself into the chair, folding her hands in front of her. Quiet is how they wanted me to stay on that flight. Quiet doesn't change anything. Her voice was soft, but each word carried weight, the kind that silences any counter-argument. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel invisible in a space they earned the right to occupy. Evelyn studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then we make this more than a headline. We make it a statement. And that's exactly what Naomi did. Within 48 hours, She stood on the steps outside the airline's headquarters in Midtown, not flanked by an army of lawyers or an entourage of assistants, but by Harold Bennett and a diverse group of travelers who had reached out to her team after seeing the story. Some were professionals who'd faced the same silent slights in first class. Others were everyday flyers with their own stories of being judged and dismissed. Naomi didn't call for boycotts or anger. She called for accountability. In front of a sea of microphones and rolling cameras, she spoke with the same calm certainty that had carried her through the ordeal. What happened to me is not rare. It's not unique. It's not even the worst story I've heard in the past 2 days. But it is a chance to do better. This isn't about punishing a few individuals. It's about making sure companies that serve the public treat every paying customer with dignity, no exceptions, no excuses. Her words resonated because they weren't dripping with outrage. They were lined with conviction. She demanded that the airline implement mandatory inclusivity and anti-bias training for all flight crews, create a transparent complaint process for passengers, and commit to a quarterly review board, composed not just of executives, but of diverse customer advocates. It wasn't about retribution. It was about transformation. And people listened. The airline's CEO, pale and visibly shaken, appeared later that day with a televised apology publicly committing to Naomi's proposed reforms. Not because they wanted to, but because her poise had left them no room to maneuver. To deny her now would make them villains in the court of public opinion, a place far harsher than any boardroom. In the weeks that followed, Naomi became more than the center of a viral story. She became a voice for a movement that had long simmered beneath the surface. She partnered with advocacy groups to launch Every Seat Deserves Service, a campaign encouraging airlines and travel companies to pledge measurable action toward fair treatment for all passengers. She used her platform not for personal gain, but to amplify stories like the ones whispered to her in the days after her ordeal, stories that often ended with humiliation but rarely saw justice. Harold the Elder, whose roar had first pierced the suffocating silence mid-flight, found himself quietly celebrated too. Naomi invited him as a guest of honor at her next charity gala, introducing him to a standing ovation as the man who reminded us all that silence can be broken with courage. The clip of Harold tipping his hat to the crowd became its own emblem of resistance, proof that allies matter, no matter how quietly they stand until the moment calls for their voice. Months later, when Naomi boarded another international flight, this time from Los Angeles to Tokyo, the crew's demeanor was different, not just toward her, but toward every passenger. There was attentiveness where there had once been assumption, respect where there had been hesitation. She didn't need anyone to treat her like royalty. She only needed to know no one else would be treated like she had been on that long, cold flight over the Atlantic. As the engines roared for takeoff, Naomi glanced out the window, the sprawling city shrinking beneath the clouds. Her phone buzzed with another message from Evelyn. Another airline had just signed onto her campaign's pledge, bringing the total to 6. Naomi locked the screen and let herself breathe. This wasn't about a single moment anymore. It was about momentum turning quiet humiliation into loud change. Her silence on that flight had been strategic, her calm, deliberate. Now her voice, steady, measured, and unshakable, was rewriting how an entire industry would treat the people it served. And as the plane cut through the clouds, rising into the open sky, Naomi Clark knew that the reckoning had only just begun. Naomi Clark's journey from silent indignity at 37,000 feet to a global force for change is more than just the story of a famous singer standing up for herself. It is a lesson in the quiet strength of restraint, the deliberate choice to hold your composure when the world expects you to erupt, and the immense power of turning personal humiliation into collective transformation. What began as a nightmarish flight, a first-class cabin where she was treated like she didn't exist, passed over for meals, ignored by attendants, and made to feel like an intruder, despite being a paying passenger, became the spark for something far larger than herself. Naomi did not scream or storm down the aisle demanding recognition. She didn't announce to the crew or fellow travelers that she was a household name with a sold-out European tour. She stayed calm, observing, remembering, and waiting. She knew that some battles are not won at 37,000 feet. They are won when the world is watching. When she landed at JFK, Naomi did not retreat into private indignation or settle for a behind-closed-doors apology. She walked through the arrival gates, where the media was already waiting, not with fury, but with poise. Her words were clear, deliberate, and unshaken. This isn't about a meal or a drink. It's about the dignity every passenger deserves. Within hours, her experience became an international headline, but more importantly, it became a platform. Naomi's composure, combined with her unwillingness to let the incident be brushed aside, forced an industry to take notice. Her response didn't just call out a single airline or a few inattentive crew members. She pushed for systemic change, mandatory inclusivity, and anti-bias training for flight crews, transparent processes for passenger grievances, and accountability reviews involving diverse customer advocates. She transformed what could have been another forgettable viral outrage into a structured movement. Every seat deserves service, a campaign designed to ensure no paying traveler is ever made to feel invisible regardless of their race, attire, or perceived status. The lesson Naomi Clark's story leaves us with is one that resonates beyond airport gates, and first-class cabin's strength does not always roar. Sometimes, true strength is the ability to remain composed in the face of blatant injustice, to choose the long game over the quick retaliation, and to wield truth with precision rather than anger. In our own lives, we may encounter moments, whether in workplaces, public spaces, or even casual interactions, where we feel diminished or disrespected. Naomi's example shows us that while anger might feel satisfying in the moment, lasting change often comes from the discipline to stay calm. Gather the facts, and then shine a light so bright on the injustice that no one can deny it. And just as important is the reminder of Harold Bennett's role, the elderly passenger whose courage to speak up mid-flight shifted the atmosphere. It tells us that silence in the face of wrong is complicity, and that any of us, regardless of age or status, can be the voice that tips the scales toward justice for someone else. If Naomi's story moved, inspired you, or reminded you of the kind of dignity we all deserve, take a moment to support our channel. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so we can keep bringing you more powerful true stories, where quiet resilience triumphs, justice is served, and lessons that matter most to all of us come to life. Together we can keep these conversations alive and ensure voices like Naomi's and those she now fights for are never silenced again.